It was a quiet evening, the kind that seemed to stretch out with a peaceful stillness. The car's engine hummed steadily as it cruised down a long, empty road. The driver, a man in his late 30s, had spent most of his life learning how to stay calm in any situation. As a former member of the military, he was used to keeping his head in stressful moments. But tonight he didn't expect to encounter something that would test his patience and composure. He had just finished a long drive from a nearby city, returning to a small town where he was staying for a few days. The streets were dimly lit, the occasional streetlight casting long shadows across the road. His car, a nondescript sedan, blended in with the quiet atmosphere of the evening. He was miles away from home, but everything seemed ordinary. Then the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Red and blue, the familiar pattern of a police car pulling him over. A wave of confusion washed over him as he pulled over to the side of the road, instinctively glancing at the rearview mirror again. The police car slowed down and came to a stop behind him. The flashing lights reflected off the trees and houses nearby, casting an eerie glow over the scene. His hands gripped the steering wheel, and for a moment everything felt surreal. What could this be about? He had been driving carefully, hadn't broken any laws. As he sat there, waiting for the officer to approach, a sense of unease began to settle over him. The feeling wasn't about fear, it was something deeper. It was the feeling of being watched, of being judged before anything was said or done. He could tell that something wasn't right, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The police officer finally stepped out of the car. The man saw a tall figure wearing a uniform and a hat. The officer's face was hard to read, but the expression seemed stern, even tense. As the officer began walking toward his car, the man instinctively looked at his side mirror, checking the surroundings. There was no one else on the road, just the quiet town and the officer, who was now getting closer. When the officer reached his window, he didn't say anything immediately. He stood there staring at the man in the car with a level of scrutiny that felt almost invasive. The silence between them grew thick. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice sharp and direct. "Step out of the vehicle." The man's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. It wasn't just the command, it was the tone, the coldness of it. There was something about the way the officer spoke that made his stomach twist. Why? The man's voice was steady, though his mind was racing. Why was he being asked to step out of the car? He hadn't done anything wrong. "Just step out," the officer repeated. This time his hand moved toward his side, and the man noticed the subtle shift in his posture. It was the kind of movement that made the man's heart rate quicken, a movement that suggested something serious was about to happen. The officer hadn't drawn his weapon, but the unease in the air was palpable. The man didn't hesitate. He opened the car door slowly, stepping out, his hands raised slightly in the air. He had learned long ago that remaining calm was key. No matter what happened, staying composed would give him the best chance at making it through the situation without escalating things. The officer stepped back slightly, still holding his stance, his eyes fixed on the man. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. The man felt a strange sense of being watched. The officer's eyes didn't soften or warm. They remained cold, calculating. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the still night. The man complied, keeping his hands visible, wondering why things were unfolding like this. What had he done to deserve this level of suspicion? "Can I ask what this is about?" the man finally asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at something in his hand, a piece of paper. It was the man's driver's license, which he had handed over without thinking. The officer's eyes moved back to the man's face, then to the license, then back again. "I'll ask the questions," the officer said. There was no empathy in his tone, just an air of authority. The man's pulse quickened. The officer's manner seemed more intense now, more aggressive. But the man held his ground. He was used to being scrutinized. He had spent years in the military, dealing with high-pressure situations where the stakes were far higher than this. But this felt different. This felt personal. "I need you to stay right there," the officer said, taking a few steps back, still keeping his hand on his holstered weapon. The man didn't move, waiting for whatever came next. The officer then reached for his radio, pressing a button and speaking into it. His voice was low, but the man could hear the urgency in it. "I need a unit out here. We've got a situation." The words echoed in the quiet night, and the man's thoughts raced. What situation? What could possibly be happening here? For a moment, the man thought about speaking up again, But before he could say anything, the officer turned and walked back to his car, leaving the man standing alone in the dark. The stillness of the night felt oppressive now. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He wondered why he was being treated like this. He had seen this kind of treatment before too many times. It was the subtle way people of color were often treated with suspicion, the kind of suspicion that was fueled not by actions but by biases. The officer hadn't given him any reason to be suspicious, and yet here he was being treated like a threat. Minutes passed, and the man continued to stand there, waiting. His mind raced through all the possibilities. What could have triggered this stop? Was it the way he looked? The way he was dressed? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this stop made sense. Finally, the officer returned, but this time there was something different about him. His posture was no longer rigid. His eyes were less focused, less aggressive. He didn't immediately draw his weapon. Instead, he walked toward the man more slowly, a strange hesitation in his steps. The officer's gaze flickered briefly to the man's military ID, which was tucked in the man's wallet. The officer had seen it earlier, but now, the recognition seemed to cause a shift in his demeanor. The man had served in the military for years, and it wasn't something he often mentioned. But now, as the officer looked at him, the situation seemed to change. "I didn't know you were military," the officer muttered, his voice softer now. That's different." The man didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. The situation had gone from strange to uncomfortable, and he didn't know how to make it better. Then, as the officer glanced back at the patrol car, something else clicked in the man's mind. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was something more. He didn't know what it was, but the air around them had shifted. He had a feeling this wasn't the last twist to this story. And in that moment, as he stood in the dark, waiting for whatever was coming next, he made a choice. He would remain calm, he would stay focused, and he would handle whatever came next. Because in that instant he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was about to happen, he was ready. The officer's change in demeanor was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. As the man stood there, the tension in the air seemed to shift. The officer had just acknowledged something, the man's military ID. It was a detail the officer had clearly missed earlier, and the moment it registered, the officer's actions slowed down. The black man, still on edge, wasn't sure whether this shift in behavior was a positive sign or just a new layer to the confusing encounter. His heart still beat faster than normal and his mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. He had been stopped by police before, but never like this. Never with a gun drawn and no explanation. Never with the suspicion that seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unfounded. The officer, now standing a few feet away, glanced back at his patrol car. The flashing lights still illuminated the road, casting an unsettling glow over the scene. The officer's hand moved toward his radio again, but this time he spoke more slowly, more cautiously. It was clear he was trying to figure out what to do next. The man waited. His arms were still raised, but now he was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about the stop anymore. It was about being judged based on something he couldn't control. It was about being treated as if he were a threat, just because of the color of his skin. As the officer spoke into his radio, the man's thoughts drifted. He thought about his years in the military, about the discipline and training that had taught him to handle stressful situations with composure. He thought about the way he had been raised, with a sense of pride in his accomplishments and a belief that respect and fairness would always be earned, regardless of who you were or where you came from. But here he was, standing in front of this officer, trying to maintain his composure while feeling like he was being viewed as less than human. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had served his country, put his life on the line in ways most people couldn't even imagine. And yet, here he was, treated like an outsider. The officer's voice crackled through the radio again, but the man couldn't make out the words. His attention was focused on the officer's every move, trying to gauge what might happen next. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. The man's mind raced, his thoughts going from one worst-case scenario to the next. What if this officer wasn't just confused? What if he had a hidden agenda? What if this wasn't just a misunderstanding, but something far more sinister? Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The officer finally turned away from the radio and walked toward the man. His steps were slower now, less urgent. He wasn't holding his weapon anymore, but the tension still lingered. The officer was still trying to piece together what was going on, still unsure how to proceed. "You're a military officer?" the officer asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. The man nodded, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Yes," he said simply. The officer's eyes flickered back to the military ID in his hand. "I didn't realize," he muttered almost to himself. The man didn't respond. What was there to say? He wasn't sure if the officer was genuinely apologizing for the misunderstanding or just trying to process the new information. Either way, it didn't change the fact that he had been stopped for no good reason, treated with suspicion from the moment the officer had pulled him over. "I'm sorry," the officer said after a moment, his voice low and strained. "I didn't mean for things to escalate like this." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, still processing the words. He wanted to respond, to say something that would make the officer understand, but he was careful. He had learned the hard way that responding in anger or frustration wouldn't get him anywhere. Instead, he chose to remain silent, hoping the officer would take the hint and realize just how inappropriate his actions had been. The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "I'm going to call this in. I just need to verify a few things and then you can go on your way." The man nodded, though he wasn't sure how much verification was necessary. He had given his military ID, which should have been enough. But at this point, he knew better than to argue. He could feel the officer's uncertainty, could see the way his hands fumbled as he tried to gather his bearings. There was something about this officer's actions that didn't sit right, and the man wasn't sure whether he was just being overly cautious or whether something more was at play here. The officer stepped back again, reaching for his radio. His voice was more composed now, but the sense of unease still lingered in the air. The man stood there, his mind running through every possible outcome. What if this was just the beginning? What if the officer decided to escalate things again? But just as he was beginning to feel that sense of dread creeping back into his chest, he made a snap decision. He couldn't just stand there and wait for the officer to figure things out. He needed to take control of the situation. He reached for his phone, which was tucked in his pocket, and quickly dialed a number he knew would change the course of this encounter. It was a bold move. In the past, he had only used his connections sparingly, in situations where things were truly serious. But tonight this felt serious. This felt like it had the potential to spiral out of control, and in the back of his mind he knew something that made him even more determined. He wasn't just any man on the street. He had served his country. He had done his part. He wasn't going to let some officer's prejudice dictate his fate. As the phone rang, the officer continued to speak into his radio, his voice distant and distracted. The man waited, hearing the ringing on the other end of the line. It was a number he knew well, a contact in the Pentagon, someone who could get things done in a hurry. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar, calm, and professional. "I need help," the man said quickly. "I'm being pulled over by a police officer and I don't know why. I need you to verify who I am. I don't feel safe." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Stay calm. We'll handle this. Give me the details. Where are you?" The man relayed the information, his eyes never leaving the officer, who was still standing by his car, speaking into the radio. The officer's posture was no longer as rigid as it had been earlier, but the man wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not. "I'll get this sorted," the voice on the other end reassured him. "Just stay put and don't do anything that might make things worse." The man took a deep breath, his mind now focused on what needed to be done. He wasn't alone in this. He had the support he needed. The officer might not realize it yet, but his actions were about to be scrutinized by people who had the authority to make sure the situation was handled properly. The man turned his attention back to the officer, who was still talking into his radio. He couldn't help but wonder how many other people had been treated like this, how many other times racial profiling had led to unnecessary tension. He had been lucky. He had the right connections to handle this situation, but not everyone had that privilege. Minutes passed and the officer finally stopped talking into his radio. He turned to face the man, his expression still uncertain. "I've got confirmation," the officer said, though there was no confidence in his voice anymore. "You can go." "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." The man didn't say anything for a moment. He simply nodded, his mind still processing what had just happened. He had been pulled over at gunpoint, treated with suspicion, and then had to make a call to the Pentagon to get out of the situation. It wasn't an experience he would forget anytime soon. He got back into his car, his heart still racing, and drove away slowly. The officer watched him for a moment before turning back to his patrol car, clearly eager to put the whole thing behind him. But the man knew this wasn't just over. The officer had made a mistake, one that could have ended much worse. As he drove into the night, the man couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one story of many. One story of a system that was broken, one story of the prejudice that still ran deep. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that something needed to change. The man drove down the empty road, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel as he tried to process what had just happened. The flashing red and blue lights were now a distant memory in his rearview mirror, but the weight of the encounter still lingered. His heart was no longer racing, but it hadn't completely slowed down either. His mind was buzzing with thoughts of what had just transpired. He couldn't help but replay the events over and over again, each time with a slightly different perspective. He had been pulled over, treated with suspicion, and nearly interrogated for no reason other than the color of his skin. He had been forced to make a call to the Pentagon to prove his identity, a call that felt surreal, as if it were something out of a movie. But it had worked. The officer had backed down. He had let him go, apologizing, as though that somehow made up for the absurdity of the situation. As he continued driving, the man felt a growing sense of frustration. The officer's apology hadn't felt sincere. It had felt forced, almost like a formality. And that bothered him more than the initial confrontation. The apology was supposed to make everything okay, to resolve the situation, but it didn't. It couldn't. It was just words, empty, hollow words. The damage had already been done. In the back of his mind, he knew he was lucky. His connections, his status, had gotten him out of the situation without it escalating further. But what about everyone else? What about the people who didn't have the same privilege, who didn't have the connections to make a phone call to someone in the Pentagon? How many others had found themselves in situations like this where they were treated as less than human, judged by their skin color before anything else? How many had been pulled over, questioned, or worse, just because of who they were? The more he thought about it, the more angry he became. But his anger wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what was happening to people like him, every single day across the country. He thought about the stories he had heard, the countless reports of racial profiling, of police brutality, of people of color being treated like criminals before they'd even done anything wrong. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents, it was a pattern, a system that seemed to exist everywhere. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of his contact in the Pentagon. He sighed, knowing that they would probably want to check in on him. He had given them the details of the situation earlier, but now, it seemed like they wanted to make sure everything was okay. He pulled over to the side of the road, his fingers still gripping the phone as he answered the call. "Hello? Are you okay?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but there was a hint of concern in it. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The officer let me go. I don't know." He apologized, but it didn't feel real. There was a pause on the other end, as though the person on the phone was processing what he had said. "I understand. We've been monitoring the situation, and I just wanted to check in. It sounds like things didn't escalate, but this is still something we'll have to look into. You shouldn't have had to go through that." The man nodded, even though the person on the other end couldn't see him. "It's just frustrating, you know? I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't speeding, I wasn't breaking any laws. But just because of the way I look, I'm treated like a criminal." The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment before responding. "I know, and it's unacceptable. But right now we need to make sure that this doesn't get swept under the rug. This isn't just about one officer or one traffic stop. It's about something bigger, a system that needs to change." He was silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. He had known this wasn't just about him. He had known it was about something far bigger, something that went beyond his personal experience. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing someone else acknowledge it, made it feel all the more real. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said finally. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else. If sharing what happened today helps, I'll do it." I won't stay silent, thank you. We'll need to gather more information, but we'll make sure you're supported through this. You're not alone in this. The man nodded, even though the conversation was coming to an end. I appreciate it, he said, his voice steady but tired. He didn't want to say goodbye, but he knew there was nothing more to say. I'll be in touch if anything else comes up. After hanging up, the man sat in the car for a moment, staring out into the empty road. The night was quiet, almost peaceful, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from being over. The officer had apologized, but the situation wasn't just about that one encounter. It was about something much bigger, something that wasn't going to be solved by one apology or one phone call. He had always known that things weren't perfect, that there were still deep-seated issues within law enforcement, but today had made it so much more real. The encounter, the way he had been treated, the way the officer had assumed guilt based solely on his appearance. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was something that happened far too often, and it was something that needed to change. As he drove back toward his temporary home, the weight of the conversation lingered in his mind. He thought about what he had told his contact on the phone. He didn't want this to happen to anyone else. He had been fortunate to have the resources, the support and the connections that allowed him to handle the situation. But how many others didn't? How many people, day in and day out, were subjected to the same kind of treatment, only without the means to get out of it? He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just let this go. But what could he do? He wasn't sure yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stay silent. As he pulled into the driveway of the place he was staying, the weight of the day settled heavily on him. The tension from the traffic stop, the strange feeling of being judged for no reason, the uncertainty of what might have happened if he hadn't been able to call for help. It all came rushing back. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting his face, and for a moment he simply stood there. The quiet of the night seemed to reflect the turmoil inside him. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, judged without cause, and pushed to the edges of society simply because of who they were. And as he stood there, taking a deep breath and looking up at the stars, he made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to let this moment fade into the past. He wasn't going to let this story be just another one of the countless untold stories. He would do whatever it took to make sure that the world knew what had happened, to make sure that others would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. The officer's apology might have been empty, but his resolve wasn't. He was ready to turn this experience into something that could spark change. This concludes Part 3. If you'd like further adjustments or more parts, just let me know. The next few days passed in a blur. The man spent his time thinking about the events that had unfolded, but the weight of it all seemed to settle deeper into his chest with each passing hour. He knew the encounter with the officer wasn't something he could just forget. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who found themselves in similar situations, facing prejudice, misunderstanding, and often violence. Even as he tried to return to his normal routine, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled within him. He thought about the officer's face, the coldness in his eyes when he had first approached the car, and the awkward apology that followed. But most of all, he thought about the way he'd been treated, like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. It was a reality that too many people lived with every day, but it was one that he had been fortunate enough to escape, at least for now. The phone call from his contact in the Pentagon had given him some reassurance. He wasn't alone in this. There were people who cared, people who understood that what had happened wasn't just an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger problem. But even with that support, he knew he couldn't let this go. He had to do something. He decided to reach out to the officer to try to get some answers. Maybe it was a long shot, but he couldn't just let this sit without confronting it. He had to know why the officer had acted the way he did. Was it ignorance? Was it bias? Or was it something deeper? Whatever it was, the man knew he needed to get to the bottom of it. He found the officer's name, which wasn't hard to do. Public records were easy to access, and he'd already learned enough to know that this officer had been with the department for a number of years. He was experienced, at least on paper, and had received several commendations throughout his career. But none of that mattered. What mattered was how he had treated him, how he had assumed guilt before asking any questions, how he had drawn his weapon without provocation. It was early in the morning when he made the call. He didn't know if the officer would answer, but he had to try. The phone rang a few times before a voice finally picked up. "Hello?" The voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a while, but it was unmistakably the officer's. "This is his name," the man said, trying to keep his voice even. "I was the one you pulled over a few days ago." There was a long pause on the other end. He could almost hear the officer trying to place him, his mind probably racing through the details of the encounter. Finally, the officer spoke. "Oh, right, I remember. How are you doing? Everything okay?" The man didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how to respond. The officer's question felt like an attempt to smooth things over, but it wasn't enough. Not after everything that had happened. He needed more than an apology or small talk. He needed answers. "I'm fine," the man said finally. "But that's not why I'm calling." There was another pause. "Okay, what's going on?" The man took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened. About how I was treated when you pulled me over." The officer's tone shifted, and the man could hear him shift in his chair. "Look, I'm sorry for the way things went down. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand." "It's not just about that," the man said. "It's about why it happened in the first place. Why did you pull me over like that? Why did you treat me like a threat?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The man could almost feel the officer's unease, as if he didn't know how to respond. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice quieter now. "I don't know," he said, his words sounding hesitant. "I guess I just saw you and something didn't sit right. I'm not proud of the way I handled it, but I didn't think you were who you said you were. I've seen situations go bad before, and I guess I just acted out of caution." The man let the officer's words hang in the air for a moment. He wasn't sure what to make of them. The officer had essentially admitted that he had judged him based on his appearance, without any real evidence or cause. The man's heart sank as he thought about how many others had been in similar situations, how many others had been treated with suspicion or fear, simply because they didn't look like what people expected. "I understand caution," the man said carefully, "but you didn't give me the benefit of the doubt. You assumed that I was guilty before you even asked me any questions, and that's the problem. It's not just about this one stop. It's about the fact that I've been pulled over before, and so many others like me have been pulled over before for no reason other than our skin color." The officer's voice was soft when he responded. "I know and I get it. I've been thinking about it since it happened. It was wrong. I shouldn't have acted the way I did." The man let out a sigh, feeling a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "I get that you're sorry, but it's not just about saying sorry. It's about changing the way things are done. It's about understanding that people like me were not threats just because of how we look. It's about doing better, about making sure this doesn't keep happening to people who don't have the same privileges I do." There was another long silence, and for a moment the man thought the officer might hang up. But then the officer spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You're right," he said. "I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it feels like to be treated like that. I can't say that I understand, but I'll try to. I've been doing this job for years, and I've never thought about things the way you're telling me, but I want to change. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." The man didn't know what to say. For the first time in the conversation, he felt like the officer was being sincere. He wasn't sure if it was just a result of the guilt he had been carrying or if this was a genuine turning point, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the officer had acknowledged his wrongdoing. That was something. "I appreciate you saying that," the man said after a moment. "But it's not enough to just say it. You need to take action. You need to make sure you're doing better. Not just for yourself, but for everyone you interact with. You need to make sure that you're never putting someone else in the position I was in." There was a quiet chuckle on the other end of the line. "I guess I've got a lot to learn." The man smiled despite himself. "Yeah, we all do." They spoke for a few more minutes, discussing the details of what had happened, and by the end of the conversation, the officer seemed more resolved, more willing to listen. It wasn't a perfect conversation, and the man wasn't convinced that everything had been solved, but it was a start. The officer had listened, and for the first time it felt like they were having a real conversation about something that mattered. After hanging up, the man sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. The conversation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. He had needed to confront the officer, and the officer had needed to hear what he had to say. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. As he sat there staring out the window at the quiet street, the man realized something. Change didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in a single conversation or in one simple action. It happened through small incremental steps. And while this encounter hadn't changed everything, it had changed something. It had made one officer think differently. And maybe, just maybe, that would make a difference in the future. The man had never imagined that one conversation could change so much. He had expected a simple apology, maybe a brief acknowledgement of his frustration, but not this. The officer's words had lingered with him for days, as had the realization that the conversation had opened a door, one that wasn't easy to walk through but might be necessary for change to truly take root. But even as he reflected on the conversation with the officer, the man couldn't shake the feeling that the work wasn't done yet. The encounter he had faced wasn't just one officer's mistake. It was part of a larger problem, a systemic issue that affected too many people. For every conversation that went right, there were countless others that didn't. For every apology made, there were hundreds of situations that ended in violence or worse. The man knew he wasn't alone in his experience. He had seen it firsthand during his years in the military, where he had witnessed, heard about, and sometimes even had to deal with the consequences of systemic racism. He had always believed in the importance of service and duty, but in recent years he had begun to realize just how far-reaching the problem was. The officer's apology wasn't the end of the story. It was just one part of a much larger picture, one that he couldn't ignore. Days turned into weeks, and the man found himself reflecting on his own role in the situation. He had grown up with a sense of duty, to his family, to his country, and to his community. But he realized now that his duty wasn't just about serving in the military or going about his everyday life. It was about speaking out, about using his position to create change. He had been given a voice, and he wasn't going to let it go to waste. He decided to take action. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there would be obstacles, but it had to start somewhere. He couldn't remain silent, not when there was so much at stake. The officer's apology had been a small step, but it was only the beginning. He needed to push for something bigger. He needed to push for real change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color. The man began reaching out. He contacted activists, organizations, and even some people he knew in the local police department who were open to having conversations about racial profiling and police reform. He didn't want to just point fingers. He wanted to be part of the solution. He wanted to use his experience to create something positive. It wasn't long before he found a group of like-minded individuals who were willing to listen and take action. They were people who had experienced the same kind of treatment, people who understood the frustration and the anger. They were people who had seen the same patterns, the same biases, and the same injustices. Together, they began working on a project, an initiative that would bring awareness to racial profiling in their community, starting with the police force. The group's plan was simple. They wanted to create a dialogue, a platform where both police officers and the public could come together and share their experiences. They wanted to break down the barriers of misunderstanding and mistrust that had existed for far too long. They wanted to create a space where people of color didn't feel like criminals the moment they were stopped by the police. The man's role in this project was pivotal. He had the experience, the understanding, and the drive to make a real difference. He wasn't just talking about the problem. He was actively trying to fix it. He worked tirelessly to organize meetings, to reach out to community leaders, and to ensure that the voices of people who had been most affected were heard. As the project gained momentum, the man began to see the change he had been hoping for. Police officers started attending the meetings, listening to the stories of people who had been victims of racial profiling. They started to realize the depth of the issue, and many of them expressed a desire to be part of the solution. The dialogue that had started as a way to address one traffic stop had turned into a movement, one that was spreading throughout the community. But despite the progress, there were still challenges. Not everyone was on board with the idea of change. There were still those who believed that things didn't need to change, that the system was fine as it was. Some officers resisted the idea of admitting there was a problem. They saw the initiative as an attack on their profession, a threat to their authority. But the man wasn't deterred. He knew that real change would never come without resistance. It had never been easy, and it wouldn't be easy now. One evening, After a particularly heated meeting with a group of officers who were resistant to the idea of reform, the man sat alone in his office reflecting on the long road ahead. He had hoped that the officers would be more open to the idea of change, but some were stuck in their ways, unwilling to acknowledge that there was a problem. It frustrated him, but he knew that wasn't the end of the story. He thought back to the conversation with the officer who had pulled him over. That conversation had been difficult, but it had been honest. The officer had acknowledged his mistake, something that many people would never do. It had been a small victory, but it had opened the door for change. Maybe, just maybe, that was the key. Getting people to acknowledge their mistakes and work toward fixing them, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. He picked up the phone and dialed the officer he had spoken to weeks earlier. It was late, but he knew this was the right time to call. When the officer answered, the man didn't waste any time. "I need your help," he said. "We're making progress, but we need more officers on board. We need people who are willing to admit that there's a problem and work with us to fix it." The officer was quiet for a moment before responding. "I know I've made mistakes," he said softly, "and I want to do better. I want to help. I think this is bigger than any one person, bigger than any one department, but I can't do it alone." "I know," the man said, his voice steady, "and that's why we need to work together. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to help us make things better. One step at a time." The officer agreed to help. He would speak out, he would advocate for change, and he would work alongside the community to ensure that the department took responsibility for its actions. It wasn't going to be easy, but together, they could make it happen. Over the next few months, the man continued to work with his team, bringing the community and the police force closer together. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Officers began to acknowledge their biases, to recognize the systemic issues that had been overlooked for so long. They started to make changes, from implementing new training programs to creating community outreach initiatives. The road to reform was long, but the progress was undeniable. As the man stood at the front of a community meeting one evening, speaking to a room full of people who had been impacted by racial profiling, he felt a sense of pride. He had come a long way from that fateful night when he had been pulled over by the officer. He had faced frustration, anger, and resistance, but he had also seen change, real change, beginning to take root. It wasn't perfect and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. "We've made progress," he said, looking out at the crowd, "but this is just the beginning. We're not done. We have a long way to go, but together we can make sure that no one else has to go through what I did. Together we can make our community stronger." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long time, the man felt like he had done something worthwhile. He had turned his experience into something that could help others. He had used his voice to push for change, and even though the journey was far from over, he knew that they were on the right path. And that, he realized, was the most important thing. Change wasn't about one moment, one conversation, or one victory. It was about continuing to move forward, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Months had passed since the man had taken the first steps toward changing the dynamics between the community and the police department. The work had been grueling, requiring patience, persistence, and a deep belief that real change was possible. But as he reflected on everything that had unfolded, he couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. There had been moments of doubt, times when he had questioned whether his efforts were making any difference. He had encountered resistance, both from officers who felt threatened by the idea of change and from members of the community who felt disillusioned by promises that seemed to be broken over and over again. But through it all, he had kept going. He had seen firsthand how conversations, no matter how difficult, could lead to understanding. He had seen officers begin to open up, admit their mistakes, and show a willingness to do better. The road to reform was long, and it wasn't always a straight path. The man knew that. But he had come to realize that real change wasn't just about the big moments. It was about the small victories, the quiet shifts in mindset that over time would add up to something meaningful. One evening, as he was sitting in his office, sorting through paperwork and organizing his thoughts for the next community meeting, he received a phone call. It was from one of the officers he had been working closely with, a man who had been one of the first to acknowledge the need for change. "Hey," the officer said, his voice crackling slightly over the line. "I wanted to let you know that we're starting to see some real changes. The departments agreed to implement some new training programs, things like unconscious bias training, more community engagement, and a stronger focus on de-escalation techniques. The man sat up straight, a sense of relief washing over him. This was the kind of news he had been waiting for. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. "That's great to hear," the man said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's a step in the right direction," the officer continued, his voice more animated now. "And it's not just lip service. We've got a team working on making sure these programs actually get put into action. It's not going to be easy, but we're committed." The man leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of pride. It wasn't just his efforts. It was the collaboration, the collective will to make a difference that had gotten them to this point. But he also knew that this was just one part of a much larger effort. There were still plenty of people who didn't believe in the need for change, people who saw any form of reform as an attack on their profession. He had encountered them before, and he knew they wouldn't be easy to win over. But the man wasn't discouraged. He had seen how far they had come, how many doors had been opened through conversations, how many minds had been changed by simply having the courage to speak up. It had been hard work, but it was paying off. "Thanks for letting me know," the man said, his voice steady. "Keep me posted on how things are going, and keep pushing for more." "I will," the officer replied. "We've got a long way to go, but we're on the right path." After hanging up, the man sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the conversation. He thought about all the officers he had spoken to, all the people who had shared their stories with him. He thought about how at first it had seemed impossible to change such deeply ingrained systems of power. But now, as the officer had said, they were on the right path. And for the first time in a long time, the man felt a sense of hope. The next community meeting was scheduled for the following week. As always, he was nervous. It wasn't about the numbers or the turnout. It was about the conversations that would happen. Would people be willing to share their stories? Would they feel heard? Would the officers who attended truly listen? Or would they show up simply to check a box? As the meeting began, the man stood at the front of the room looking out at the gathered crowd. There were familiar faces, community leaders, activists, and members of the public who had been coming to these meetings for months. But tonight there were also new faces, police officers, some of whom he had never met before. He could see the apprehension in their eyes, the uncertainty about how this would go. It wasn't easy to be in a room full of people who had been hurt by the very institution you represented, but that was part of the process. The man took a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "This isn't just about us sitting in this room and talking. It's about us listening, really listening to each other. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what so many people in this room have gone through." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of both the community members and the officers. "This is about creating a future where people aren't judged by the color of their skin or the way they look, where we don't make assumptions about each other based on stereotypes. It's about rebuilding trust, not just between the community and the police, but between each other as human beings." The room was silent as he spoke. He could feel the weight of the words, the significance of the moment. This wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. It was a plea for understanding, for compassion, for change. He could see the officers listening, some of them nodding slightly, as if considering what he was saying. And he could see the community members, their expressions a mix of hope and skepticism. It wasn't easy to put faith in a system that had failed you so many times, but the man had seen small glimmers of change. He wasn't asking for everything to be fixed in one night. He was asking for a commitment to try, to keep working at it, to keep fighting for a better future. After he finished speaking, one of the officers in the back of the room stood up. He was a tall man, his uniform pressed neatly, his posture rigid. The room went quiet as he began to speak. "I know I've made mistakes," the officer said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "And I know I've been part of the problem, but I'm here because I want to change. I don't want to be the kind of officer who makes people feel unsafe, who judges people based on how they look. I want to be part of the solution." The man could see the sincerity in the officer's eyes. It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. It was a recognition of the harm that had been done, and a willingness to take responsibility for it. It wasn't easy for an officer to admit that, especially in front of a room full of people who had been hurt by the very institution they served. but it was a step toward healing. The room erupted into applause, and for a moment the man felt a lump in his throat. This was the moment he had been waiting for. It wasn't just about policies or training programs. It was about people. It was about hearts and minds, about the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward something better. As the meeting continued, there were more stories shared, more conversations, more moments of understanding. There were still difficult moments when tempers flared and old wounds were reopened. But there was also a sense of progress, a sense that they were building something together, a bridge between the community and the police that had been broken for far too long. When the meeting ended, the man stood by the door, shaking hands with those who had attended. He felt exhausted but hopeful. They weren't done yet. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. As he walked home that evening, he reflected on everything they had accomplished. It hadn't been easy, and there were still many challenges ahead. But change was happening. One conversation at a time, one officer at a time, one community member at a time. And that, he realized, was the key. Real change didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. And it was worth fighting for.